AI is not an oracle. An LLM is not an oracle and cannot manifest meaning without having input from humans. Isn't that wild? Is that, like, for some reason, taxonomy and ontology and knowledge work is considered this sort of set it and forget it, that you do it once and it doesn't need. Normally, it's the siloed nature of most organizations. It really depends on the structure of the organization. But I think it's better to examine this from a perspective of where we see things fall apart. So while an organization can say that their data is high quality and well governed, it really matters when it shows up in things like analytics.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Data Reality Check, where data meets the real world. I'm here again, Amy Raygada, Data and AI Strategist at ThoughtWorks, ready to host today Jessica Talisman. We're going to talk about a very nice topic today about ontologies, taxonomies, and so on. This is the space where we step away from the hype, the tooling, the wars from LinkedIn, and we want to talk about what actually happens, what data is supposed to influence real decisions by real people in real organizations. Today, we're going to tackle a question I hear all the time from boards to data teams. Why does good data still fail to influence decisions? Because most organizations don't actually struggle with data availability. They have a lot, but they struggle with meaning, with ownership, and the last mile between insight and action. And that's exactly why I'm so excited to have you today.
Thank you for having me, Amy. I'm really excited to be here.
Thanks a lot. So a little bit about you, Jessica. So you're a semantic engineer and information architect with more than 25 years of experience designing taxonomies, ontologies, and knowledge structures across enterprise, cultural institutions, and digital platforms. Jessica's work sits at the intersection of information, architecture, ontology, and AI. But what I really appreciate is that she brings deep thinking about meaning into very practical, real-world systems. I love your articles. I'm always looking forward for a new one. She's also the mind behind Ontology Pipeline, which frames semantic work not as one-off exercise, but as something that evolves, gets maintained, and delivers value over time. So welcome, and thank you again for accepting the invitation.
Thank you.
All right, I want to start with something fundamental here. So for the audience, because I see a lot of confusion on LinkedIn, on Substack, about the difference between taxonomies, ontologies, and knowledge structures. Can you give us just a little bit of insight about these three concepts?
Sure. It's interesting because as we tackle these issues, I've refrained from returning to the ontology pipeline, but I have new material coming out soon that will explain these differences in more detail. But a taxonomy is a hierarchical structure, a classification structure that's used to categorize and classify information. And when I say classify, I don't mean classified as in PII, although that can be included. But it's parent-child relationships. That is essentially what a taxonomy is. An ontology is a logical, formal reasoning structure that extends beyond a hierarchy and is able to, through formal logic, create relationships and imbue a taxonomy with properties and attributes. Those are descriptive decorators that add more context and meaning to data. And a knowledge graph is really an architecture, because there can be a million, much like a fingerprint, there can be a million different ways to architect a knowledge system. A knowledge graph will often have more than just a taxonomy and ontology, can represent or include NLP, knowledge bases, ETL and ELT could possibly be part of that extract, transform, load. So it's really an elegant architecture that represents a knowledge infrastructure.
Okay, thank you. So if I can say it in simple words for the business people,
Yes.
you know, that's why I wrote also my book, to talk to the business people. So
Yes.
taxonomy is basically a folder structure. So it says, like, where does this belong? If we talk about an ontology, it's shared meaning plus rules. So what is this and how does it relate? And a knowledge structure basically is the full system. How do we use this knowledge for anything else, as you mentioned, ETLs or NLP or whatever else you would like to do?
Yes. Yes.
Good. When organizations say that they have good data, which most of them say, right? We know this is not the reality. They usually mean that it's complete, accurate, maybe even well governed, which I highly doubt sometimes. But in practice, that still doesn't guarantee the decision change. So, from your perspective, where does data usually fall apart between being technically correct and being usable for decision making?
Normally it's the siloed nature of most organizations. It really depends on the structure of the organization. But I think it's better to examine this from a perspective of where we see things fall apart. So while an organization can say that their data is high quality and well governed, it really matters when it shows up in things like analytics. So, data analytics will often surface. We have dashboards, we have ways of driving decision making within organizations. Often, data can be biased. It's used specifically to initiate or to advocate for certain initiatives within an organization. It substantiates decision making. And when the data is incomplete, which is, I think, one of the biggest issues, or you end up with incomplete data structures that also give incorrect or inaccurate views of the business, incomplete views of the business. That's where we start to see silos and failure to actually capture knowledge within an ecosystem. Another place we see this is within like tagging structures. Usually, knowledge is activated or implemented as tags for documentation and content. And so sometimes we'll see things like difficulty and in discovery or findability of things within your ecosystem. If you're looking for a document within your intranets, for example, or you're having a hard time co-locating, which is sort of a librarian term because that's my background, but you'll have co-location of artifacts within a good search system where the data is accurate. When data is inaccurate or incomplete, we see this where it's difficult to find all of the assets within a certain topic or tag structure. So tagging and content organization and analytics are usually where you see the symptoms rise up. And those should be your first clues that something's wrong with the underlying data.
And you think that this gap comes down to missing a structure basically around meaning, context, or share understanding, or all of them?
All of the above. It can start with things like shared vocabulary. We're moving into a world where natural language is more important. So one of the core aspects of data governance is, and we hear this term thrown around quite a bit, data democratization.
Hmm.
Um, it's the idea that everyone should have access to information ready at their fingertips, especially with AI when we have product managers taking on more technical roles. And so, the idea of access is really, really important um, because when things do not appear in natural language, if we can't search from natural language, really the source is having those common vocabularies that are able to connect to the underlying data, that are able to drive things like accurate tagging and findability and discovery, accurate representation. Ultimately, taxonomies and ontologies and knowledge graphs are a form of AI. And we seem to lose sight of that fact. And neurosymbolic AI um, is the actual representation of these things in machine readable, understandable format that's also machine readable and understandable for humans. So it's machine readability and human readability that leads to the common understanding of these things.
I completely agree. Actually, for me, sometimes it's because I work with a lot of clients, right, in consultancy, and I'm very surprised. A lot of people have like this great shiny data platform, but they don't have a semantic layer at all. They don't have like proper data modeling. They don't have any understanding of all the data they have in there. And I see how they invest heavily in these pipelines, in these platforms, but very little in making this data understandable. and as a product, right? As I would like to talk a little bit of data as a product as well, but I don't feel like they have it ready for someone to use it, as you said, to be democratized. Because if you don't know what you have, how you're expecting the people to be able to access it, right, or to understand what is in there. And I understand that we have now the data catalogs, right, supposedly, but the maintenance sometimes is too high, and no one wants to have an ownership out of it.
Yes.
Um, I would like to touch a little bit on ontologies as products, not on artifacts. I know they are not exactly products, but I feel like they are deeply rooted or related in how you create your data products. Because if you have as a foundation that, then you can create a good data product. What are your thoughts about that?
Oh, geez. I've formed my opinion. I just want to give this little precursor. I've worked at quite a few organizations. So I've experienced many different domains. And there's a common theme is oftentimes product can tend to box in or constrain the reach of an ontology or a vocabulary. Ownership can do the same thing. So, what we see most often is that the team or the area, say that it's a product team, which is more often than not the case, um, decides that they need an ontologist or they need an ontology. So, therefore, by way of having the idea and initiating the project, the product conceptually, it can often get stuck in product land. And the constraints of it can become myopic in that we get really overly focused on the nature of an ontology as a product. And so there was a pivotal point in which, when I was hired at Amazon, I was brought in as a program manager, an information architect. And that was eye opening because it made me realize that building something like an ontology where it can possibly originate in a product, that's fine because we all need use cases and what have you. It was more important to have it built or orchestrated as a program. Because an ontology, again, back to our original point, a taxonomy and ontology is not a one and done.
Mm,
And it's not something that is constrained to a single product. If
yeah,
it's meant to become that layer that connects the business and resolves data across boundaries, team boundaries, then it's about agreements and sustained management of that artifact or that thing over time. It's about making agreements cross team boundaries, cross platform boundaries, and really making it an operational program that can sustain itself for the long haul. And so as we know within products, when we build a product that has an ontology, that might be one lens into our data structure. But in order for us to capture the other aspects of the business and the general data landscape, a program allows those connections past the boundaries of a product.
yeah.
So, yeah, that's my thinking on it. But yes, it's instrumental to a data product.
Yeah, I don't think they are necessarily a product, but they need to evolve over time, right? Because
Hmm.
the nature of the business change. So as you mentioned, I believe same as data products, they want to stay the same. You need these kind of feedback loops, right? Go
Yes.
over it, see what has changed, and do some maintenance
Yes.
here and there. Because that's one of the problems that I have seen a lot, right? They put some ontologies, some semantic layers, something there, and that's it. Everybody forgets about it, and
Isn't that wild? Is that like for some reason taxonomy and ontology and knowledge work is considered this sort of set it and forget it, that you do it once and it doesn't need. But if we think about it in terms of, for example, because I come from a library background, we'll think about it in terms of resources and file formats. And so a library or a sort of organization or institution, we call it GLAM, which are galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, that sort of world, which has a huge interconnected web or network of information that interoperates based on these same principles. If a library collection is constantly getting new books, and is constantly negotiating interlibrary loans where you can order a book from Russia if you wanted and have it delivered to you. That type of system works because it's constant iteration, maintenance, and additions and manipulations to that underlying structure. You don't set it and forget it, or else any new incoming information and resources are never going to be accounted for in that system. So truly, the reason why I created the ontology pipeline is that we're not focusing on the structure. For years, the data industry has been focused on big data and the collection and storage of data, but it has failed to take account of how we organize and structure this data to be meaningful and interoperable for both machines and people. So when we look at this from that perspective, it's not a one and done. It's something that truly involves a lot of data literacy, but also um, involvement from various teams and maintenance from various teams. And a data product is one of the most perfect places where we can actually surface things like dashboards that account for data quality and the structuring of our data, that can take feedback from people when there's incoming new knowledge entering an ecosystem.
Yeah, for me that was crazy. Not long ago, I was with a client, right, and they didn't this that I mentioned before. No semantic layer,
Yeah,
nothing, just a bunch of data, dumped in GCP, and they wanted to create some kind of data marketplace, but how if you don't even have this kind of structures?
right.
And they were complaining that they have troubles even with the dashboards to drill up, drill down, or do more exploration. But when you don't have any structure, and structure like this is impossible. It's virtually
Yes.
impossible. That you will start doing like a little bit of fixes here, a little bit of fixes there, and over time this is not going to be sustainable at all.
Yeah, like a really interesting use case and experience I had was I worked for a major ad tech company and major partners with Google. And what was fascinating is they had a dashboard that basically governed the creation of, and it was a data product. It was the idea of creating a dashboard so that you could predict with 15-minute delay where you could place your bets for campaigns and ad groups. And ad campaigns and ad groups that people pay a lot, and companies, organizations pay a lot of money for to advertise, for example, within Google's ecosystem, is dependent and reliant upon words, upon concepts, because you use those concepts to launch your campaign and to organize your ad groups. And on that dashboard, without that reconciliation of duplicates and without the reconciliation of synonyms and acronyms and vocabulary, it can fracture your search, but also your analytics in that you're not actually co-locating and creating these robust language ecosystems that are able to account for. Many people within the knowledge graph community, within ontology or the semantic community, will always drill in and say it's more than language, because it is more than language. But right now, generally within the data world, we're dealing with language. That's where we're understanding semantics, but we're not understanding the structure. The structure is what helps to reconcile and maintain good data quality, be it a taxonomy, which is hierarchical parent-child, or an ontology, ideally both. So in order to truly understand the nature of language, it has to have context, which is also the other big buzzword. And context
Yeah.
comes from the relationships and the meaning of data, which is defined using ontologies. So as we sort of assemble these building blocks, while it may seem like a big investment of human capital and actual monetary capital up front, it ends up saving businesses tons of money on the backside.
Yeah, I do believe in that because also is that as well, but you also see in the past, like 10 or 20 definitions of revenue or this
Yes.
or that, because no one knows how to even define it. So every team has their own definition. So the same data analyst probably created like 10,000 dashboards with the same information for different teams in different ways to calculate that. And that's a very big problem. You have basically a cemetery of dashboards there that is actually spending a lot of money that you can save
Yes.
if you have structures that make sense, right? It's also about
Well,
harmonization of the data and so on.
and with AI, we see the savings start to increase when we look at sort of context windows and tokens, for example,
Mm,
because the default in most organizations is we don't have data organization or knowledge organization. So we're going to have AI do it for us, which is also very dangerous because AI is not an oracle. An LLM is
yeah.
not an oracle and cannot manifest meaning without having input from humans. I'm not saying not to use AI at all, but I give my new upcoming article on taxonomies because I'm walking readers through how to build taxonomies, and using the ontology pipeline framework. And, you can take something like journey, which would be, and this is my example in the piece, is that you take Journey, a product company that we're going to call Acme Analytics. And Acme Analytics has a concept or a feature called Journey. If we give that sort of ambiguous branded marketing sort of speak to an LLM, there's no way for an LLM to know that we don't mean Journey, the rock band, or Journey, the actual traveling, actually traveling through.
Yeah.
How is AI to know that it's a feature? You can give it all the context you want. But the idea is that we're trying to push the boundaries of these context windows, which is more ephemeral.
Yeah.
Ephemeral in that you enter the context up front when you prompt an AI to try to render some structure and meaning out of your data. It's extremely expensive. If we took all of that context window token spend and allocated it to actually building infrastructure, the longer term outlook is you'd be spending a lot more money because you wouldn't have to be entering all of that into the context windows. Plus, you'd have the provenance and the traces to account for decision making by AI. And so it's really a much larger problem. I know we weren't really talking about AI, but that tends to be the de facto or the default response when teams say, well, we don't have ontologists, we don't have knowledge management, we don't have the bandwidth to structure our data or to reconcile it properly, so we'll just give it to AI.
Yeah.
And that leaves organizations sort of limping along and spending an incredible amount of money on tokens.
Yeah, that's crazy. Actually, I love that we're touching this topic because I see also a lot of these problems right now when the clients come and they're like, I want this magic one of an LLM to figure out everything and just bring me the product or do some agentic AI and this is going to save my business. Or I just want the uh, powered by AI stamp in my website,
Yes.
and it's
Yes.
about that. And they don't care like how it's getting. And like, usually when I go, because I do a lot of AI strategy, some of the things that I ask them, okay, what's the level of accuracy that you
Right.
need for whatever you want to do, right? Because there is a lot of hallucinations that might completely mess up the responses that you're giving to external people if you're doing like like front end kind of things, let's say a chatbot or maybe some kind of an assistant or so on. And this is gonna be a problem with your reputation, with your
Hmm.
credibility eventually when it's in production. Yeah, I don't care, I want to do AI. And I'm like, but usually I try to tell them, look, this is not going to work. And I don't want
Yeah.
to be part of this narrative because
Yeah.
I don't want to be responsible.
Yeah, and there's huge liability in doing that. Another organization I worked with, pretty large organization. You see these architectures where they're building chatbots. To your point, like a use case, like we want a chatbot. Well, chatbot is not a new architecture. Those existed for years before
Yeah.
this current, foundational AI movement. And I am of the thinking that if you cannot master chatbot architecture, you shouldn't be able to graduate. That should be everyone's proving ground to determine if they're ready to mature to the next stage, because chatbot architecture is a very sort of closed system. You see things like hard coding SQL queries, mapping
Oh, yeah.
them to text. Yeah. I mean, it's just a really complex SQL queries that, databases change, just like vocabulary changes. database schemas change. And there's a huge risk in doing that
Yeah.
because we're taking syntactic approaches to try to manifest knowledge. Um, the other thing that proves the point that SQL databases cannot render knowledge um, and do not represent knowledge organically. When you have primary keys and foreign keys that sort of dictate the structure of rows, columns, table structures, it becomes very complex to orchestrate and these sort of syntactic approaches with AI.
Yeah, one of the problems that I've seen most of the times when I'm doing this kind of data strategy gigs is that they have an idea and they come with this urge like, we are getting behind, right? It's like,
Yes,
I
it's
don't care,
panic.
we are getting behind. Yeah, it's some kind of a FOMO
Yes,
there. And then they usually have some kind of a data scientist team, sometimes even just a researcher team, right? And then they just put some uh, regular software engineers who just started to understand what is that, and then they try to implement that. And this is when we see this kind of
yes,
hard coded code. No one cares about the responsible AI, governance, and all the stuff that you need on top of that to create really good
yes,
AI, right? They don't know how to do anything else because they are just pure software engineers trying to get into the data world.
yes,
And that's one of the biggest mistakes, of course. And of course, the data scientists also, they are just like, oh, we are just researchers, so I need someone to implement it, no matter what. We are doing AI,
yeah,
and that's it. Business said that we
yes.
should.
And as a consultant, I'm asked to adjust your expectations. This is where we are now. And you end up with this below the lowest common denominator, sort of basement level implementations that I'm sometimes wary of. I'm not sure that I'm happy endorsing this only because it's like sort of band-aid fixes or um implementations where you're just, this beautiful taxonomy that you've constructed and built is flattened. We see that more often than not. Structures are flattened. The whole idea of structuring of taxonomies and ontologies is that there's dimension. It's not
Yeah.
flat. It's not flat. And so when these structures are flattened, you're taking away inference. And what do we hear from AI companies? One of the most important things for AI to be successful is inference. So it leaves us in this sort of weird spot where it's like, I've given you structure, you've flattened the structure. So that leads me to the next thing is that there's opportunity for innovation that we're overlooking. There's the implementation phase where we want to implement taxonomies, ontologies, controlled vocabularies, like, really, really healthy knowledge ecosystems or infrastructures. But the other problem is, how do you get that into production? How do you implement? And we aren't spending enough time. That's where data scientists, data engineers, software engineers have an opportunity. Is yes, there's the structure. Don't try to change it. Don't try to flatten it. If it's a problem that there is structure, let's start to innovate of how we can maintain the structure instead of having to flatten everything.
Yeah, completely agree. But we see this so often now that sometimes I feel like, okay, I roll my eyes because I hear the same rhetoric from everyone saying like blah 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 AI. I want agentic, no matter what. It doesn't matter what is the quality of structures. Nothing. It doesn't matter. They just want it like now. We are really free writing consultancy to be whoever you want. There are some consultants that are gonna, yeah, sure, we can make it happen, and they will deliver something that doesn't make sense. But I'm more the one that I'm like, please stop. As you said, take a breath, and maybe this is not going to be a 3-month roadmap as you want, but it's going to take 18 months or 20 months
Right.
or whatever is necessary. But you need this foundation to be able to go farther. And once you're here, the
Yes.
other ones are going to fall apart, or you're going to still standing because you did the things right.
Yes. And you see some product people, my apprehension around this is somewhere that I think product folks need to be heads up, especially data products, is this idea of sort of crowdsourcing and assembling vocabulary on the go. And that is also very dangerous. It's only dangerous. It's not gatekeeping. It's not pedantic, as many in sort of the data product world have said. It is essential that we build knowledge infrastructure correctly so we don't amplify the existing problems. So, while we call them folksonomies, where you crowdsource vocabulary and knowledge organization, it's called that's exactly what it's called. It's called a folksonomy. It's called a folksonomy because it's crowdsourced. It's no different than like if we're on Instagram and everyone creates hashtags. It's sort of a tagging type of environment and sort of freewheeling. We see it in Jira, we see it in Confluence as sort of like creation of tags and natural vocabulary coming from the ether. But ultimately, those things do have to be reconciled and taken more seriously. Now, my biggest concern is the lack of emphasis on knowledge organization and management. Um, that's the problem space I'm working on right now. And the reason I created the ontology pipeline is like, gosh, does it help if we simplify the process? Does it help if we if we educate people to understand that just like you have a data management or a data program, shouldn't we have the same type of program for knowledge organization and structure? That's the bigger question is why organizations are not investing in knowledge, yet we're talking a whole lot about knowledge, but we're not actually investing in the in knowledge management as a muscle and as an organizational muscle and a required operation within an organization.
For the audience, what changes when the teams stop treating ontologies as an static artifact and start treating them as a living system that support decision, analytics, and AI? What are the benefits? How do you put these there so everybody understands the need of this, right? And why it needs
Yeah.
to be done like now.
Yes. Yes, and you hear a lot of folks that there's a new misinformation that's emerging um, because I think of it like people are holding their feet at the door. They're like, no, I don't want to go here. I don't want to do this because it seems very arduous, very difficult. Like, where do I start? What do I do? I don't understand. I don't, it's that transition, that sort of threshold is there. And we're all looking across that threshold into the next room. And it's very daunting. And so, investment, whether it be upskilling people in place in knowledge management, because it is an actual discipline, much like data science and data engineering, is opportunities for upskilling, but then also the misinformation is starting to leak in, which is part of the resistance, which is the idea that taxonomies and ontologies are static artifacts that only capture what exists at one point in time, which is not true because when you have a sustained program that permeates every part of the organization, it's no longer static. When we realize that knowledge management is iterative, continual, and constant, it's no longer static. It's probably one of the greatest superpowers that you can gift your organization.
I agree. I actually like the example you gave before about the library, right? That you have new books and some of them get purchased and maybe they are not in stock anymore. Or that's why this needs to be taken into consideration and update all the time. How often do you think that you need to go through it, review it, and update your taxonomy, your ontologies, and so on?
And I see, like, for example, what I think is frustrating for me is I see organizations dump so much money into AI initiatives working with insufficient, incomplete, or poorly structured data. And and you see the high failure rates of AI projects and what have you. Wouldn't that money be better invested in actually building the correct infrastructure to support AI first? And that's the missing link. That's what we're missing. We talk all day about context and about knowledge and yet we miss and semantics. Those are the three biggest buzzwords right now.
Yeah.
So if we're talking about those things, those are the three qualities: semantics, knowledge, and context have been the mantras of knowledge management for more than a century. So that sort of mismatch in understanding what the requirements are for AI, yes, data is part of the equation, but the knowledge infrastructure is the other part.
But how often do you think this system needs to be maintenance? You know, like for example, you will say depending on the on data products perspective, right? You might say, okay, maybe some data products needs review every 2 3 months, some of them every 6 months, maybe one is once a year. How often do you think this needs to be reviewed?
I'll give you this opinion. So going back to that library example, how what happens if you take the librarians out of the library? So it's constant. It's part of a daily workflow. The ideal is that you actually hire people that are knowledge management experts, taxonomists, ontologists, knowledge management, and that team, that sort of core team, is tasked with maintaining, updating, versioning, and and working hand in hand with data teams to update and keep freshness. So that's been a constant in almost every single role I've served for the past 10 years, is this concept of freshness. And that freshness can only be obtained if we have knowledge management and infrastructure as part of one of our core operators or operations within an organization. And so the other part we hear is organizations saying, oh, well, we can't afford that.
Yeah.
So we can't afford to hire someone. We can't afford to have someone who manages that. We can't, let's just distribute the tasks amongst, I don't know, 10 different people within our analytics and data product team. How realistic is that as a solution? If we imagined that analytics was distributed, or the tasks of managing a data product were distributed throughout an organization amongst many different people within, individual contributors, I don't think we'd get very far. We'd have very good data quality or knowledge infrastructure. It really needs to be managed and taken seriously, much like, data programs are, that we need to be
Yeah.
building knowledge programs. It's sustained. It goes back to that idea of just it being sustained and constantly managed.
Do you think this goes side by side with data governance?
It does. I mean, it has to. It has to, because data governance, whenever, it's really interesting because no matter the role, the data role that I have served, whether I've been hired as a product manager, and this maybe will give you some insight, is normally when I've been hired in the past 10 years, I've been hired as a product manager, as a program manager, as an information architect, as someone, I mean, like, there is no standard role for someone like me who brings my skill set. So, more often than not, when I enter an organization, I'm also expected as part of my job description to also build the governance for whatever the knowledge program is. So I'm wearing the governance hat, the taxonomy hat, the ontology hat, the knowledge management hat. My last role at Adobe, I was wearing 6 hats, including building the data governance. So yes, like the governance is much needed, but that one person that's hired for your organization could not wear all the hats anymore, because you're not going to end up with a very sustained program long term. It needs to be distributed and shared, and data governance is one of those sharing spaces where data governance then can proliferate and communicate those messages outwards and help to manage the actual governance of knowledge.
I completely agree because, well, I've been also working for 20 years now. At the beginning, I was in software engineering, but I moved to data back in 2012-ish, something like that. And from all the data roles, I had all the possible job titles that you can imagine. And when I
Yeah,
was doing data
yeah.
product management, I was also doing data governance and architecture and a lot of things, that doesn't really match a product project manager role, let's say that way, right? Um,
Yes.
One of the things that I see, and it's very unfortunate, like data governance is still is, as I put it in my book, like the data police, and they are
Yes.
still
Yes.
being not respected, right? Because oh yeah, these people is so annoying, blah 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 blah. And I think this part where you are is also kind of the same. It's like, oh no, now we need to do this. As you said, it's taking a lot of time. We need more people. No, no, no,
Yes.
no one from the
Yes.
team knows how to do it. And this like resistance, but it's so needed, and I think both of
Yes.
them are hand by hand, as you mentioned as well. That's also my thought. Like, if we have good structures, we can govern the data better, and it's something that is not a one person job, but it's multiple
Yep.
teams, right? And I believe in the ownership, for example, okay, you have a data product, you have a data product owner, this person owns the governance, the access, and so on. But this person also needs to be able to talk to the person in charge of the knowledge, and the person who is in charge of
Yes.
the governance, right? To align and everybody works on the same path, let's say it this
Yes.
way.
That's where I've seen the most successful knowledge infrastructures implemented is where a data product is leveraged with a data quality dashboard that has signals across each team that is able to govern completeness, basic data quality, accuracy, reliability, all of those metrics, and basically have, you know, completeness bar, accuracy bar, relevancy bar, all of those things where everyone can access. And it's not necessarily police or that anyone's in jail or anyone's in trouble. It just gives visibility and transparency into each person's contribution to the greater whole. One thing that we know that AI has done to data ecosystems is it's starting to collapse the stacks. And I do think that we're all sort of desperately clinging to this old world of these predictable boundaries that, and vectors of control. And as these stacks collapse, and I think that product management is kind of core to the collapsing stacks, in that those boundaries are being blurred, is that data products have an opportunity to help to substantiate and support good data governance, good data quality. The opportunity where, again, back to that most successful implementation, it was where we had 44 teams all creating their own data, their own tags, their own language, their own processes. And it was creating what we called Compass. It was a really cool dashboard where you could see your team's data health, but it also had a tab where you could request new terms or new concepts within the system. You could give feedback to knowledge engineers. You could share assets. You could gain access. So the idea of building a knowledge platform, much like it's a more sophisticated catalog if we think about
Yeah.
that way. Library system has an interlibrary catalog system, and that system is meant to reach across every single networked library in the world so that I can find every book or magazine or scholarly print article or film or music, that by song, but it will show me by location the format that it's available, how far it is from my house, how many copies are available, and then gives me the option to check out. But the only way that type of system works, where you have these really robust network systems, is if you have a governing layer, be it the taxonomy and ontology, that is able to mitigate and negotiate across the underlying data landscape.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It sounds like a beautiful world.
Right?
Unfortunately, I
I
think
know.
we're really far away from that in most of the organizations.
Yes. Yes, but you see like successful implementations, and we work with those implementations every single day when you go to Wikipedia or Wikidata, any of the Wikimedia
Mm.
ecosystem. It was just announced that all of the major tech companies, not all of them, but like Amazon, Google, they've made an agreement with Wikimedia Foundation for access to, because the training data is such high quality. What people don't realize is that Wikidata and Wikipedia, it's actually a knowledge graph, uses ontologies and taxonomies, and that's what makes it so robust. The same goes for the Getty's ecosystem. The same goes for the Microsoft graph, even the LinkedIn graph. We can look across all these ecosystems of where we admire, or we sort of unconsciously use these as sources for good structured data. The systems we admire are the ones that also have data governance, ways of reconciling data across complexity, ontologies, and taxonomies. So the examples are there. They're large examples, they're successful examples, but the examples and use cases are there. But the gap between reality and where we need to be is pretty large.
Yeah, and I think it's because they don't get named or promoted sufficiently, right? You see the use cases, but as you said, okay, you don't understand what is behind that, and again, with all these hypes or new words, or the context graph now, or meta agents, and next
Oh
week
gosh.
will be another word, right? You know how it is. So people is just looking at
Yeah.
that, but they don't look at the real implementations that actually bring values. That makes sense that you
Yes.
copy that, not a buzzword from LinkedIn or from Substack or whatever you're reading.
Yes. Yes. And like, even with the word context, I was sitting, I wrote a whole series on process knowledge management. And it was a fascinating series to write. I was able to meet with and work with Sepharel. It's a knowledge management and infrastructure type consultancy out of Milan. And what was interesting is that this group um, had a 3-year EU commissioned research project partnering with Siemens and Bosch and like some pretty large industrial organizations, proving out the use of taxonomies and ontologies, specifically procedural knowledge ontology. And they were able to prove out the efficacy of managing process knowledge. That's an established domain, using ontologies. So I wrote this 4-part series in December. In January, Context Graph article comes out, which is basically dealing with process knowledge. And all of a sudden, we're distracted from the knowledge management problem. And a context graph became all the buzz, as we've seen for the past few weeks. Not coming from an expert in the data space. It's actually coming from Foundation Capital, which is an investment firm and VC firm. And so the other problem is that we're so quick to just glom onto or attach ourselves to unfounded concepts that don't have any research. Zero research, zero demos, no proof of concept. Grabbing onto those sort of fly by night or sensational headlines that tell us, oh, context can be solved with context graphs, in terms of decision traces or what have you. It's like that.
It's crazy.
It's crazy. It's crazy. Like, where has our critical thinking and information literacy gone? It's the idea is that knowledge management is not new. Taxonomies and ontologies are not new. These systems predate the internet, the web. These systems predate, they go back to card catalog systems, for example, classification systems for organizing resources. And so being able, innovation happens when we build upon founded, proven concepts. It's the sharing of research, but also the building upon what we already know in order to arrive at innovation within a space. And AI is the innovation opportunity. And we know that knowledge is necessary. Structured, contextual knowledge is necessary for that. Now, my 2 cents is I feel like context graph was ripe for the taking because context was looking for a home. It was a
Mm-hmm.
word that was floating out there that had such a large meaning. It could shapeshift depending on the conversation or the sentence. And it gave a nice home for the word context
Yeah,
that made it,
yeah.
we're attaching too much to the buzzwords. And granted, this is a way for us to communicate about things, but we need to ground those things in truth. So that's the other part. And truth is founded research, proofs of concept, domain practices, and expertise.
Yeah, it's for example, like I remember January, end of December, January 2024, 2025, the buzzword was agentic AI. And it was
Yes.
all these like for the
Everywhere.
whole, yeah, everywhere. And no,
Yes.
as well, no context, very few experiments in a very controlled environment, nothing that really scales so far, right? And then everybody's like, okay, I have my new venture capital. We're doing this, we're doing that, blah, 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 blah. The next
Yes.
one now
Yes.
is meta agents because we have the meta grid from Ole, for example. So now people
Yes.
wants to leech on that word as well and put it somewhere
Yes.
else, as you said with context, right? And now context graph, and it's as you said, it's that we have so much information and we are so misinformed that it's crazy, right? Because you don't know what to believe, who is writing the truth or not, who is using LLMs just for the sake of using LLMs and inventing things. Um, it's just very difficult to. That's why I don't follow that many people on LinkedIn. But the people that I know that actually
Yeah.
are investigating or doing something, or is interesting to read something from them, that I know that it's not just some emojis, and
Right.
ChatGPT
Right.
kind of things.
And that's like a really, really interesting dichotomy. It points out an interesting dichotomy between, for example, the EU versus the US. The US, we don't have really regulations or uh, or any sort of guardrails over the deployment of AI. The one thing that we're seeing in the EU is that there are developing guardrails. It's not perfect, but there are developing policies and guardrails around this. Plus, EU had the foundation of GDPR and some protections of people's personal information that helps to also create natural guardrails. But I think the most instrumental thing is that academia has been involved with the development of AI systems in the EU, more so than in the United States. There's more input from academia, from research, from experts in these systems. That's taken a little more seriously. In the US, academia is kind of being pushed aside.
It's very sad actually, right? Because if you see, of course, the US is full of these startups and things, and there is no regulation or
Yeah.
whatsoever. But the other day, I was reading something, and I was talking to someone about why Germany, because there was like some kind of a meme that the US is like evolving a lot in terms of AI and this and that, but Europe is behind. And of course, we have the EU AI Act, right? That is kind of we cannot have like black box models. We cannot have a lot of things there that are blocking. And it said, yeah, because you're blocking innovation, but also they are protecting the data of the people, trying to make systems more reliable and so on. Because if you see, like every day, I think we have a new startup doing something with AI, and there are a lot of violations there. And that's why now AI is being used also for doing these deep fakes and this kind of stuff, because the lack of
Yes.
regulations that we have everywhere. Maybe, yeah, Europe is getting a little bit behind. But what I like is they are not like in this sense of they are not thinking, oh, we're getting behind. They are like, we're doing what we're doing right now, and we're trying to do the things right. It's not
Well,
perfect,
and
but
I would argue that EU's not behind because when we ultimately look at who we are building for, who are we building AI for? Like, who are the end users? And the end users are the people. And
yeah,
so, one of the things that the US is failing to grasp, and this may be controversial, but I believe it to be true, that most US companies and startups are building for economic reasons, for
yeah,
profit, for corporate profit. And it is mirroring what happened with social media, the runaway train that is social media. It's operating off of, in the US at least, off of some of those same principles. And so, one thing that I find really elegant with how the EU is approaching this problem space is the slowness, the consideration, the careful consideration of the users being the people, not
yeah.
corporations.
Definitely that's something that I see a lot because, for example, one of the biggest auto companies is part of ThoughtWorks right here in Germany, and the innovation team is in the US because they are not blocked. Right, they are not blocked if they are in US.
Yes.
If they do this innovation of AI in Germany, they cannot deploy a lot of the things that they are currently doing. But you see this double rhetoric, let's say, right? We are safe, we
Yes.
care about people, but let's innovate somewhere else because we might be doing something not that ethical, maybe. As
Right.
you said,
And the
more corporate.
ethics, more corporate, and that's really the driving force in the US. Yeah, there isn't a whole lot of dialogue, and I actually think it's I'll reserve my thoughts about Davos, but um right now Davos, the theme at Davos is dialogue.
Mm,
Um and that's something that's absent from a lot of, the dialogue, especially about AI's impact on society. It is crucial that we be having these conversations. Because, for example, if there's a larger gap in policy, as you said, you have teams that are able to experiment and do all sorts of crazy things not allowed in the EU in terms of research. Um, Ultimately, how many of those things can be implemented, um, given the regulations in the EU, given the consideration for the social welfare of people, of the users of AI. And that's really like where I think we're going to see more of a sort of split, and a fracturing, but also an isolation of, we're all of these startups. One thing we can look at is China's development with AI. They have pretty strict regulations to benefit people in society. That's the whole idea. Is ultimately, if you look at sustained growth, this isn't about quick wins and quick profit, but sustained growth is built upon your user base. You have to ultimately answer to your user base, and the user base is society.
yeah. But you also see, like, for example, now a lot of CEOs and CTOs are getting some kind of a bonus if they fire people to be replaced with AI,
Yes.
right? It's
Yes.
it's it's crazy, right? And again, they
Yes.
don't have the knowledge. The LLM won't have the knowledge, the context, the way of
Yes.
doing things as a human. It's okay to use it as a helper. For example, now I'm working in a project for AI for software development. So
Mhm.
it's just basically we're creating a system that helps to move from a legacy system data stage from IBM
Mhm.
to GCP. And then we use AI just an assistant to translate the pipeline, to make sure that it makes sense because this data stage is super complex and no one can unlock this world from there, but the AI can. So then the data engineer review it, and then the data engineer implement it in GCP, and that's it. When it's as a helper, it's
Yes.
fine. But the people, when they think that just an LLM without the context, without the knowledge, without any good,
Right.
foundation, is going to do the job for you, and you can fire all the people, project managers, developers, and so on. We are going in the wrong direction for sure.
Oh, yes. And what's interesting is that as I have been writing this new piece, which has been a real beast, I know from writing your book, you probably understand that when you're trying to break apart really complex topics in sequence, it can be very difficult to succinctly and very simply explain. And you did a beautiful job in your book, by the way, of doing that. Um, but like within knowledge, for example, when I build a taxonomy, the one thing that's really important is that scoping of your first use case, and being able to have sort of a closed, very clean use case to experiment with and build for. And so, just like we developed user requirements and product management, so we develop use cases, we build those use cases, we collect use cases, we build requirements. And you can rank those use cases and requirements. It's a classic product management where it's like by priority, the team that owns it, that sort of classic framework. We do the same with taxonomy building in order to determine where to start our build, our focus for some knowledge management effort. So those same tenets, that same ethos that product management has should be carried through to building cases, obviously for AI, an AI sort of implementation, but it's the same type of framework that we use for building or developing a knowledge infrastructure. So that alignment is critical. And so that idea of like having a very fine use case where it can be implemented, tracked, measured, and we can actually see the benefits and it's lower risk, for example, um, then it helps us calibrate, adjust, and determine what is actually needed for successful AI implementation.
That's yeah, that I wanted actually to ask you about it. What do you think is needed? So thank you for answering that. Um so I would like to ask you a couple of questions. We're about to finish the recording here. So first, what's one thing leaders should stop doing if they genuinely want data to influence their decisions?
Stop blindly funding AI initiatives just because it has the name AI in it. It that there needs to be more data and a checklist of infrastructure requirements to substantiate whatever a proposed initiative is. So right now, data leaders are sort of blindly approving anything with AI in the title. So I think that leaders need to really examine their budgets and how much spend on tokens, for example, for context window usage and things like that. Look at their data infrastructure and data quality, and that to really consider um, investing in infrastructure first. Because ultimately it's not going to if you don't have the infrastructure, you're not going to get anywhere very fast. So that's my one request for data leaders.
Thank you. Actually, that goes with my second question that I had for you. Like, what is one belief about data, AI, or governance that sounds reasonable, but is actually holding organizations back when it comes to investing? And you just basically reply to that. These crazy AI projects with no head or toes at all,
Yes.
that is not going to go anywhere.
It's not going to go anywhere. And it's no excuse to say we can't afford to have a knowledge management team, or we can't afford to hire a semantic engineer. We can't afford to hire a taxonomist. Like, I think that it's that realization that it's possibly one of the best investments you can make in your organization. Every single organization should at least have a librarian, at least. Because when we're looking at knowledge management, it goes beyond things in a database. It's just the fact. And so it's that investment from organizations that they took just a fraction of their spend, they can hire one person. The idea of hiring a team, you see this sort of this crazy wild investment with where companies are paying 500K plus for machine learning engineers to try to help solve the knowledge management problem, but those people are not trained in knowledge management. And so we're sort of misappropriating spend and trying to solve the problem every which way, but the most practical solution, which is actually building your knowledge infrastructure.
Everything is about knowledge at the end.
Yes. Yes.
All right. Thank you very much, Jessica. This conversation really highlights something I care deeply about data, that it's not only about creating value, but it's also about understand it, trust it, and use it correctly. Of course, good data is not enough. Well-designed knowledge systems treat it not only as a static system, but something that really moves around and is going to keep evolving over time is what really makes the difference. And thank you very much for the audience. You've been listening to Data Reality Check, where data meets the real world. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch up next time with more real talk from the front lines from data and AI. Stay data driven.